네. 코로나
Yes,
19를 맞이해서
due to the COVID-19 pandemic,
대전환기를 맞이하고 있는 이 순간에도
and because of
세계
this
평화를
crisis,
요구하면서 오늘
we are here online, but nonetheless, we are here in this
제7
forum
세션에
which celebrates peace.
저는
Let me introduce myself. I
지난
will be the moderator for this partner session 7. And in 1989, for the first time in Korea, the Public Administration Office was established for the first time at Hallym University, and I was a full-time professor here. I will be leaving the university this year, and I am also director of the Korea Christian Cemetery Association. I am also president of the East Asia Peace Institute, and this institute is a research institute searching for practical means to achieve peaceful coexistence in Northeast Asia. We want to learn from the history of war and also through the DMZ and the remnant of the World War II, the Article 9 of Japanese Constitution will be are subjects of our activities, in which various civic groups and citizens participate. Yesterday, we had the opening ceremony of the Peace Forum, and unfortunately, at that very time, Russia did what it shouldn't have and started its attack on Ukraine, which reminds us that the road towards peace is very bumpy and challenging. Nonetheless, we all strive for a peaceful world, and we're gathered here in Gangwon Province, which is the only divided nation province in the world, and here we are discussing ways to move forward. And the theme that we will be discussing is the end of war declaration and the way forward. And in this particular session, we will be discussing the role of citizens of Korea and Japan for peace in Northeast Asia and peace constitution. And we have various experts and academics who will discuss this. Allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. First, from Korea, we have His Excellency Lee Soo-hoon, former ambassador to Japan. He is sitting here right next to me. Next to him, we have Mr. Hong Hyun-ik, Chancellor of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and we have Emeritus Professor Osaka Yuji of Sejong University, and Mr. Choi Byung-wook, Professor of Sangmyung University. And from Japan, we have Mr. Kondo Soichi, a member of the representatives of the Japanese House of Representatives. We have 120 minutes allocated to us, and I will give 15 minutes to each of the speakers. The time left over will be allocated to Q&A and also group discussion. So, first of all, we will start off with a presentation by the former ambassador to Japan, Mr. Lee Soo-hoon, who will be speaking on past relations. Mr. Lee is currently a professor at Gyeongnam University also. So I will hand over the mic to him.
Yes, is the microphone on? So I really want to say today a few words on, as you well know, the deteriorated Korea-Japan relations, partly due to COVID-19. But overall, the relations are in bad shape, and we barely have any government-to-government discussions. I want to look at the cause of this current situation. between Korea and Japan, there are various conflicts over history. And the reason why the relations have worsened is 80% due to the conflict over history. There are two main issues. First, the comfort women issue, which is one of the main cause of conflict. And secondly, there is the mobilization of wartime forced laborers, which is another main cause of conflict. And looking into the comfort women issue first, I think that between Korea and Japan, and for Korea, there are policies, actions, and words spoken that may cause conflicts. But I think the main underlying cause, well, of course, former Prime Minister Abe is no longer serving as Prime Minister, and we have a new Prime Minister in Japan. But while he was serving as PM, and he formed and led his cabinet, during those times, they chose what is called the historical revisionism. It is basically about forgetting the past and not placing the burden of the history onto the future generation. And the cabinet's main position was to erase the past under historical revisionism. And because the cabinet chose this line, various conflicts surfaced. And it's not just to say that the onus is all on Japan, but during Lee Myung-bak administration, the President Lee himself visited Dokdo Island. I believe it was sometime in 2012, which provocated Japan intensely. As you know, the Dokdo Island is claimed by both Korea and Japan. It may not be a conflict that arises every day, but since Korea has effective rule of Dokdo Island and effective control, Korea just has to continue to keep controlling the place well. But because the president himself visited Dokdo Island, it was a huge provocation to Japan. And this was quite a determining factor in deteriorating relations between Korea and Japan. And then moving on to the Park Geun-hye administration, the comfort women issue was at the fore. And unless comfort women issue was to be resolved, and to let me go to my slide. Yes, here it is. And President Park placed the comfort women issue at the fore, and unless this issue was resolved, she would not have a summit with Prime Minister Abe, was her basic position. And whenever she met with President Abe at international conferences, the relations remained quite rigid, and this further deteriorated relations. But unlike this stance, in December 2015, Korea and Japan, after behind-the-scenes contacts, announced what was called the Comfort Women Agreement, which was expected to resolve comfort women issues, but ended up actually making things much worse. Soon after this agreement came out, the victim groups and civic groups were very strongly against the agreement and led to much controversy. And in the end, there was candlelight vigil protests against the agreement. And one of the main voices of the vigil was to break the deal, which included many comfort women victims and civic groups. And then there was the presidential election in Korea. And at the time, the main atmosphere was to break the deal of the Cover Women Agreement of 2015 and to renegotiate from scratch. So at the time, the Democratic Party campaign pledge was, in fact, to break the deal and renegotiate. And following this flow, the Moon Jae-in administration took power. And because this was a presidential pledge, the president himself was in a very sticky position. And with the new administration taking office, the government decided to look into the Comfort Women Agreement by setting up a task force, which worked for about 4 months. And then at the end of 2017, December 2017, they released a report of their findings. And after the report came out, based on the report, and the government released its position formally on January 9th, 2018. And the basic position was as follows. The agreement could not resolve the dispute over the comfort women issue. Nevertheless, the Korean government will not seek the renegotiation of the December agreement, which is an important part. And the Korean government expects Japan to accept the truth in accordance with universal standards of the international community and continue to endeavor to restore the honor and dignity of the victims and heal their emotional wounds. This is really what Japan has to do. Regarding the Comfort Women Agreement and the Comfort Women issue, the Moon Jae-in administration requests Japan to be in line with the international standards and to work towards restoring the honor and dignity of the victims and to heal their wounds. And the wording was that the Korean government expects Japan to do so, not demands. And victims are, of course, most important. We have 13 surviving victims at the moment, and the victims have always consistently wanted a voluntary and sincere apology from Japan. Korea, the civic groups and the victim groups do not want very much from the Japanese government. What they want are number 2, 3, and 4 from Japan that you see on the slide. And as long as Japan accepts these requests, the Korea-Japan relations will be back on track. And also, the Korean government set aside 10 billion won of Korea's own budget to support the victims. And this was the sum that the Japanese government put forth as a result of the Comfort Women Agreement. And the Korean government's position is to replace the sum with Korea's own budget. And the agreement also included setting up a foundation to support the victims, to disseminate the funds of 10 billion won. And the Reconciliation and Healing Foundation was thusly set up, but this foundation was dismantled because the victims in the summer of 2018, in their 90s, the survivors in their 90s, visited the Blue House and the front court and to protest to the government. And they were very much in bad health, and it was quite risky for them to do so, but nevertheless, they did not succumb. And so this foundation could not be sustained. And whenever Prime Minister Abe met with President Moon Jae-in, he started off by demanding that Korea adhere to the Comfort Women Agreement. And whenever the two sides meet, instead of touching upon some new issues, Prime Minister Abe would always consistently raise this matter, which led to much frustration and really deteriorated the relations. And in Japan, there is a National Security Council, just like the one we have in Korea. And the chief of Secretariat of the NSC in Japan was Mr. Yachi, who is a very experienced diplomat. I met with Mr. Yachi many times, and the first time we met, he brought up the Comfort Women Agreement. He was actually one of the key drivers behind the agreement, and I believe that he had a very much affection for this work, and he quite was caught up with the agreement, and he would bring it up every time I met him. And in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, there is the Comfort Women statue, and he also demanded that we remove the statue. And that's how we came to the current situation without being able to resolve this issue. Let me come back to this issue later. And the second historic issue is the mobilization of forced labor workers. There are different ways to look at this issue, but when the Pacific War broke out in 1941 and lasted until August 1945, to prepare for the war, labor wars were forcefully mobilized. And this issue is about compensating the forced labor wars. And this matter is basically a monetary matter. It is in nature quite different from Comfort Women's. Comfort Women issue is more about the honor, the emotional wounds, the dignity of the women, but whereas this is about the compensation for the forced labor wars. And the size of the number of victims is estimated to be about 210,000 according to the official count of the government, but this number, there is no fixed number for the victims. And there have been a series of lawsuits raised by the victims. And then on October 30th, 2018, the Korean Supreme Court delivered its ruling. So it's the Supreme Court, the final court, after the first and second instances. The Supreme Court ruled, and on the damages claims against the Nippon Steel and Sumitomo Metal, which is now Nippon Steel. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. This is a very important ruling. While the Korea-Japan relations are in very bad shape, a very determining factor that really worsened the relations even more during the Moon Jae-in administration was this Supreme Court ruling. The judicial procedures are still ongoing. The Japanese government called this ruling one that fundamentally overturns the basis of Korea-Japan relations and continues to confront Korea on this matter. And now Prime Minister Kishida is in office and he maintains the same position as Abe. He says that the ruling is a violation of the 1965 Korea-Japan Claims Agreement and therefore a violation of the international law and demands corrective action. While conflicts over history remained unresolved and continues to worsen bilateral relations, in summer of 2019, the Abe cabinet took action to restrict exports on some of the key chemicals to Korea and removed Korea from the export whitelist in August that year. Being on the whitelist would simplify the exports procedures. But you may all remember that there was also a boycott of Japanese products here in Korea. So this was an economic retaliation against Korea that led to economic conflict. And such measures did not stop at economic conflicts, but dealt a blow to the two-track diplomacy between Korea and Japan. The two-track diplomacy is where we handle issues of the past, such as the wartime forced labor wars or comfort women issue, while on the other hand, continuing to expand and develop a future-oriented cooperation in terms of the economy, tourism, culture, and so forth. But by taking such measures, Japan mixed up the two different tracks of historical issues and the future-oriented cooperation. So to give you the conclusion, there will soon be another presidential election in Korea, and a new administration will take office. And right now, having dialogue with Japan, it's not happening. And I'm sure that the Japanese government has some expectations for Korea. And so I think that the new government in Korea should be proactive toward Japan. And it is not just up to Korea. The Japanese side must also demonstrate two actions first. Number one, Japan should withdraw the exports control from 2019. Then this will lift off the restrictions and start pump priming for improving relations. And secondly, the political leaders in Japan must show a healthy perception of history and demonstrate such through various messages. And this has already been done by the Kono statement, Murayama statement, Joint Declaration on a New ROK-Japan Partnership towards the 21st Century of 1999, Naoto Kan statement that consistently included attrition towards the past, apology, responsibility. But this did not resolve all the conflicts over history. And still, the statements included recovery of the honor and dignity of the victims. But the Japanese side must show a sincere interest and a sincere mindset. And I believe that the two-track diplomacy must be restored, but we must go beyond that. There are global issues such as climate change, the pandemic, and so forth, so we need to build up a new multi-track diplomacy that can cover wider topics such as this. Thank you. Thank you very much. I apologize for not being able to give you more time. As an scholar of international affairs, Mr. Lee, has looked into diplomatic affairs, and based on his work as former ambassador and also based on theoretical studies, he presented the importance of having to change the perception towards history.
Now we will be hearing from Mr. Hong, Chancellor of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. He is also an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the Security Council, and he was also the chief of the security issues at Sejong Academy, and he is also a member of the Committee on North-South Economic Cooperation. So he has a lot of hands-on experience as well as a long history of academic study into the theories related to these issues. So I'm sure that he will be giving us a lot to think of. Good morning. I am Hong Hyun-ik, Chancellor of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. It is a great honor for me to be here at the PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022, and I hope that this kind of forum for peace will be a great success, not only this year, but onwards as well. Now, I will be focusing on measures to restore peace on the Korean Peninsula and throughout Asia, and how the two governments of Korea and Japan should work towards this. And because the role of the U.S. is very important here, I will also talk about how the Biden administration should respond. So, first, I would like to point out the issue that U.S.-China relations has a big role to play in peace in this area, but also because of stopped dialogue between the two Koreas and no progress on the nuclear dialogue. These are all issues, and we only have conflict because all of these dialogues are halted. So what role did the U.S. and Japan play? The Korean government worked very hard towards peace. I'm sure you all know this. Even the conservative side in Korea focused on the fact that the current administration was working only on peace. They said, why aren't you preparing against war? But this is nonsensical because, well, first, the current administration did work towards peace, focused its energy there, but it's not that we discarded war preparation. We may not have expanded our war budget, but of course, it's not that we can work on a nuclear program, but with that aside, when it comes to conventional military power, we have more than 5 tons of warheads, and missiles have been developed. And we haven't been going here and there advertising that, but we have worked continuously to work on our war capabilities as well. So it's untrue when the conservative camps say that we have neglected our war preparations. My focus will be on why the current North Korean nuclear issue is not being resolved. I will be focusing on fundamental issues and reasons, and also it's unfortunate that North Korea is not coming to the table, but we want to look at why North Korea is not coming to the table and what policies should the other parties put in place to encourage North Korea to come forward. In order for a nuclear negotiation and if we have a improved relation, then North Korean and Japanese relations will also be resolved, I believe. But currently, because there are no dialogues between the North Korea and not only the South, but the U.S., and there's only conflict that's left over, this kind of conflict will come into the way of doing away with all of the obstacles. So I want to focus on how we can make a virtuous cycle. So let's focus on the core, why the dialogue is at a standstill. And this is my point of view. I have a firm belief towards this. Now, if you look at the past North Korean regimes, they have violated human rights, and in the 70s, South Korea and North Korea were the same, but North Korea has failed economically because their GDP and our GDP is 53 times larger than North Korea. It's 160 times smaller than Japan, and only 1/600th of the US. So they are at a disadvantage when it comes to economics. There is nothing that they can rely on. That is the basic principle that I believe in. So even if it goes above their expenses, they are left with no choice but to resort to nuclear weapons. They are trying to work with partners that have an economy that is more than 50 times, 160 times, 600 times larger than them. But historically, if you look at the fact that you have to accept the fact that North Korea has, of course, broken many past agreements. But we also have to acknowledge that North Korea tried to do its part in the recent talks, but the U.S. did not do its role. They did not stand there with their arms tied, but they did not. Sorry for not going through the slides. I haven't come here yet, but anyway. We have a war now in Ukraine, and there is a tension with China, so I guess Washington is busy. But in their approach to North Korea, you can see that they have been neglected. And so nationally, the U.S. has focused more on China than North Korea, although working with North Korea would have been better for them. So that is just the situation in a nutshell. Well, Trump and Kim Jong-un, back in 2017, they engaged in harsh dialogue when President Moon was first inaugurated. But thanks to the efforts of President Moon, Kim Jong-un decided to come and meet with President Moon, and we have special envoys, Mr. Seo-hoon, who is the National Security Advisor, and the head of the NIS, and these advisors and envoys went to Pyongyang to meet with the regime, and thanks to that, we were able to come to the June 12th US DPRK summit. But up until that point, the two countries were in a very strained relationship. But thanks to President Moon, we were able to come to the 2018 U.S. and North Korean summit. Like I said, the U.S. has an economy that is 600 times larger than the North. But if you look at what was agreed on, the North Korean requests are number 1 and 2, and number 3 and 4 are the U.S. requests, and they agreed on all 4 of them. And President Trump probably did this, agreed on this because he wanted popularity, but he had to keep his side of the deal for there to be trust and for North Korea to do its part. If you look here, the last one is the returning of the remains of the prisoners of war and those lost in action. North Korea actually did this. And also what North Korea did is to repair trust. It sent people, the U.S. citizens that they had held captive, 3 of them, through Secretary Pompeo. Also, long-term missiles have not been launched for the past 3 years. So they are still holding their side of the deal. And I think for the US, the biggest issue is long-term missiles. And the launch facilities in Dongcheon were halted in 2018. The fall of 2018, it dismantled it without any condition. And after this Singapore summit, President Moon went to Pyongyang, and the reason he went to Pyongyang was to make sure that the North kept its side of the deal. As you can see, the North kept its side of the 2018 deal. The US decided to agree to work towards better relationships. So the US should have at least made some kind of gesture or even have a meeting or summit for the opening of a consulate, for instance, but there was no such effort whatsoever. And another one was to work towards a peace regime. And so President Moon worked very hard towards this, and we have now proposed the end of war declaration. But the US is non-responsive to this one as well. So if you look at what has happened, you can see that the US has done nothing, whereas North Korea has tried to keep everything that it agreed to. So what can we say to that? So to Pyongyang, President Moon went, and his agreement at Pyongyang was that the North Korean side would do away with its Yongbyon facilities. This accounts for about 70-80% of its nuclear capabilities. Of course, it will still have about 20 or 30% of its kappa somewhere else, but this would be a huge step towards denuclearization. And President Moon got this from Kim Jong-un. And so the US would have to meet this. What it said was that it would not do away with the recent UN Security Council's resolutions. Trump said that he was unable to do this and he left the meeting venue. I think maybe Trump should have met Kim halfway, perhaps saying, well, all 5 resolutions is not reasonable, so maybe I will be able to work on 2 or 3. But you can see just how Trump used this occasion just as a publicity stunt. So in September of last year, President Moon proposes the end of war declaration. This is something that he and Kim Jong-un had agreed upon already, and also in the previous administration of President Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-un's father. This is a very, very symbolic gesture, but you can see that the US is reluctant to agree to this. Now, the US and Korea have actually agreed on the draft, but now North Korea is lukewarm to this. And another important issue is that Japan is very reluctant to agree to this declaration. And I think that the role of Japan is very important here, but they are negative to the outcomes. Now, President Moon, when he visited Pyongyang and spoke with Kim Jong-un, and he came back to Seoul, the first thing he said at the press conference was that we talked about the effectiveness of the end of war declaration. We also talked of issues of the US forces and the UN command status. And Kim mentioned that this would be of no issue. Now, the related parties are saying that they are against this end of war declaration because of the US forces and the UN command, but we have heard from Mr. Moon, our President Moon, that this will be of no issue. Now, these are some future scenarios of the North Korean nuclear program. I think that we have to work towards this through the Ukraine scenario, but as we have seen, Ukraine is on the brink of war, and they provided Ukraine with a security guarantee if they gave up their nuclear program, but they were unable to do this. And also, if the relationship with China is strained, as you can see here, we will be unable to solve the North Korean nuclear issue if the relationship between the US and China is strained. Then is there a possibility of North Korea engaging in provocative actions? Well, we have a presidential election in early March. And if we look into the past examples, you can see that sometimes you may think that it would be good for the North Koreans to be friendly to the incoming administration, but they have actually, in the past, engaged in provocations every single time. So there is always the possibility of that happening, especially in April, which will celebrate Kim Jong-il's birthday, which will mean that there is a possibility of them launching a so-called satellite, which they will say they are doing it to celebrate peace, but is actually a long-term missile. When that happens, this will have a bad effect on the middle elections in the US and will badly affect the Biden administration. So I mentioned Ukraine already. If we look into what happened in Libya, we saw that they gave up their weapons of mass destruction, and Gaddafi was killed in a conflict later on. So this gives Kim the lesson that giving up his nuclear weapons will not end in a good ending. And with Iran, they promised the country that they would lift all sanctions if they merely freezed their program. But Trump became president, and Iran broke their side of the deal, saying that the former president, Obama, made these various pledges, but they are not being upheld. Like I said, the US has an economy which is 600 times larger than North Korea, and they have seen what has happened to former countries, so what would they think? So in order for us to restore trust, we have to take a more positive role and engage North Korea in a very different way. Now, what the US is trying to do is going to a summit by starting from a practical level. But the important thing is that people on the working level don't have any decision-making authority. So even though they are having these practical level meetings, there is no progress. And this kind of an approach taken by the Biden administration is just a reflection of how not interested they are in this. Now, coming back to today's theme, what has Japan done in this process? What did Prime Minister Abe say? Every time he met Trump, he said, don't negotiate with North Korea, don't trust Moon Jae-in because he is siding with China. So Abe came in between the way. I don't know how this will be taken by our Japanese colleagues, but this is a fact. So the Abe administration, what they did was focused on the abductee issue of the 18 abductees. Prime Minister Koizumi visited us and focused on this and is making this peace policy an issue of these abductees, although there are only 3 or 4 people left. So I think that there is a bigger role that Japan can play. Also, with regards to the end of war declaration, they are against it, saying that it's very dangerous. So this is coming in the way between peace on the peninsula. Lastly, I think I've passed that slide. Okay, let me be very brief. As former Ambassador Mr. Lee said, Japan has trade restrictions on the South, although we are an ally. So they have to lift these restrictions. And also Korea, I think, needs to retract their complaints filed with the WTO against Japan so that we can restore trust. Also, second, with regards to the comfort women issue and the forced labor issue, we are focusing too much on compensation. But this is not an issue of money. I think with Japan firmly recognizing what happened in history and giving a sincere apology, I think that would do. I am working with the government. I am a public official, but this is just a personal view that I have. Of course, we need to go back to the 1998 Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi declaration and have a summit meeting between our 2 leaders and work towards a partnership on the international stage. Also, I think that we can work towards peace. What I sincerely want is for us to work towards the abductee issue, but to do this, we need to solve the nuclear issue and also the normalization of our relationships. We have to do this together. The abductee issue should not be a prerequisite of the nuclear issue. So my sincere hope is that it will be made part of the package and not a prerequisite. Also, because we need to restore trust, I hope that the Japanese government would agree to this and also support our end of war declaration as well. And as Ambassador Lee underscored, issues such as climate, environment, energy, natural disasters, and natural issues and also health are all issues that we should work towards in multilateral cooperation. Yes, thank you so much. I am sorry for not being able to provide you with enough time. We heard from former Ambassador Lee and also the Chancellor. Their presentations had synergy and were intertwined. There was a mention on the end of war declaration, which is actually the overarching theme of this year's PyeongChang Peace Forum. We touched upon the partners, and we are seeing that the surrounding neighbors, both maritime forces and land forces, are using the Korean Peninsula for their own interests. So Korea and Japan are right next door. We can't move physically. And Japan can only be safe when we have peace on the Korean Peninsula as well. So I think that we need cooperation on all of these issues, including the end of war declaration. Now let's move on.
Next up, we have Professor Hosaka Yuji of Sejong University. He is the Daehyang Humanity College Daewoo professor, and he's quite famous in Korea and is the most receives most respect as a Korea-Japan relations expert. Professor Hosaka Yuji received his degree from Tokyo University Engineering Department, but during the Olympics in Korea in 1988, he moved to Korea and he actually acquired Korean citizenship. He has continued to study Korea-Japan relations before being naturalized in 2003. He received his PhD from Korea University, and as mentioned, he was the Daewoo professor of Daehyang Humanity College of Sejong University. Hello, as introduced, I am Hosaka Yuji from Sejong University. University. Good morning. Today, I would like to touch upon the Korea-Japan relations with a focus on the Kishida administration, since Prime Minister Kishida is now in office. I would like to look at and give you an outlook of Korea-Japan relations under the Kishida administration very briefly. First of all, the perspective of Japan on Korea-Japan relations must be understood by us. This is very important. And to do that, we need to look at some of the mentions of Korea by Japanese prime ministers. This will be very important. And from the very basic speeches delivered by the PMs of Japan, and how Korea was mentioned in these speeches is quite important because it reflects the general Japanese policies towards Korea. In January 2020, at the time, Prime Minister Abe Shinzo delivered his policy speech at the Diet, and including this phrase, essentially, South Korea is the most important neighbor with which Japan shares basic values and strategic interests. I sincerely hope South Korea keeps the promises made between the two countries and works towards building future-oriented relations. The key point here is that South Korea needs to keep promises made between the two countries, particularly regarding the ruling on the wartime forced labor wars case was a huge issue at the time. And by referring to a promise made between two countries, this would include the ruling and also the comfort women issue and other treaties or agreements reached by the two countries, and that it must be kept by South Korea and that Japan is itself keeping to those agreements. And he excluded any new diplomatic agreements. And he just urged South Korea to implement the agreements already reached. And such interpretation can be provided from this statement. And he is basically saying that Korea has to change, not Japan. Moving on to the Suga administration, which took power in September 2020, and in October 2020, at the time, Prime Minister Suga also gave his address to the Diet. Let's look at how he mentions Korea. He said, and I quote, "South Korea is a very important neighbor. Based on Japan's consistent positions, I strongly urge South Korea to take appropriate actions to restore healthy relations." Again, consistent positions of Japan, such as those on comfort women issues or forced labor issues, those issues are all over by the 1965 Korea-Japan Claims Agreement and also the Comfort Women Agreement. But Korea keeps raising this issue, making demands. Korea is wrong, Japan is right. And any diplomatic negotiations are excluded by this statement. And it's basically saying that Korea should follow what Japan is arguing. And so he maintained the same position as Prime Minister Abe in his speech. And after a year, the Suga administration gave way to the following year to Prime Minister Kishida. And again, he gave his policy speech at the Diet and mentioned Korea as follows. Korea is Japan's important neighbor. Japan will strongly urge an appropriate response from South Korea to return the relationship to a healthy one in line with Japan's consistent position. Again, this is in line with former Prime Ministers Abe and Suga. So the consistent position of Japan remains intact and unchanged regarding forced labor issues or comfort women issues. Korea is wrong. So Korea should adjust its position to be in line with that of Japan. So basically, the statement also is a refusal to any diplomatic negotiations. But from the common sense of international communication, the promise between two nations are always subject to change. Japan refuses to make any changes to agreements reached with Korea, which is quite suspicious. For example, the Chorus FTA, depending on what the U.S. demands, Korea has changed its positions numerous times. So even though an agreement is reached between two different nations, depending on the situation, the diplomatic negotiations can take place to make any readjustments or corrections to prior agreements. So this is just a common sense from the international perspective, but Japan persistently refuses to make any changes, which is quite concerning. And the basic position of Japan is that Japan is right. And I think that this common sense is not fully respected, sometimes not even by the Korean side. And former Prime Minister Abe and current Prime Minister Kishida are different in that Kishida comes from the moderate Kochikai faction, whereas Abe comes from the staunch conservative faction. So the basic political lines of the two are quite different. And Korea needs to understand this, and I think that Korea does understand this. Suga is in between. He doesn't have a very clear ideological background. So Kishida, Prime Minister Kishida comes from the Kishida faction. The nature of the faction is very important because factions lead the politics in Japan. There are 6 factions in the Liberal Democratic Party, and each faction asserts slightly different ideas with different nuances. The head of the Kishida faction was Makoto Koga. When Kishida came to office, he said, on the basis of conservative mainstream politics, the Kochikai must always adhere to the pacifism, basic human rights, and sovereignty of the people in the Constitution. And he also said that shaking hands with the devil, by devil he meant Abe and Aso, the former 2 prime ministers, to achieve the goal. Well, although he belonged to the same Liberal Democratic Party as Abe and Aso, he still called them devils. And in saying so, Mr. Makoto Koga said that shaking hands with the devil is sometimes necessary, but if you follow the devil's words, this is unforgivable. This was basically a message to Prime Minister Kishida. Shaking hands with the devil means that when Kishida came to office, because of the nature of factional politics, for Prime Minister Abe or Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Aso, he had to rely in some part on Abe and Aso's power. But Mr. Makoto was saying that still Kishida should not do as the devils say. And Prime Minister Kishida, again, originally is a moderate and mainstream conservative. In 1945, Japan lost the war. At the time, staunch hawks were dominating the political power, but with the defeat of the war, the control went over to the hands of the moderates. And so the conservative politics of Japan after 1945 was really dominated by the moderates as the mainstream. But since 2020, the general power shift started towards the staunch conservatives, and the really completion of the staunch conservatism was Abe administration. So the conservative politics, there are two main flows: the moderates and the staunch conservatives. And we Korea need to understand this background. The Koichi Kai, the main notable moderate faction, currently called the Kishida faction. This person is the former Secretary General Kato, who famously argued for a US, China, Japan equilateral triangular theory. So Japan should have equal distance towards China and towards US, according to former Secretary General of LDP Gato. The Koichi Kai, their general position was to maintain equal distance from China and US, not biased towards either, and to strike a balance between the two in its diplomacy. As you know, former Prime Minister Abe's line, the staunch conservative line, was to keep China in check and to strengthen the security alliance between US and Japan. In Korea, between the conservatives and the liberals, there is a very similar difference in opinion between the conservatives and the liberals in Korea. And such a similar difference exists within the LDP of Japan, between the moderates and the staunch conservatives. So, Prime Minister Kishida originally comes from the moderate faction, and so he is trying to step out of Abe's influence, as we can see. For instance, on November 11th last year, former Prime Minister Abe became the chairman of the Hosoda faction, which is the largest faction. And so the de facto Abe faction was launched. Abe faction has 96 LDP members and is thusly the largest faction. But Kishida faction has about 47 members. And so in terms of number of faction members, Kishida needs the help and support of a larger faction. And so the power of former Prime Minister Abe is still very influential. But if Kishida continues to remain in the influence of Abe, then Kishida's original moderate, pacifist line cannot really be exerted. And so one of the recent talks is that since Kishida was victorious in the October elections, which was quite important, started to distance himself from Abe and is envisioning what they call a grand Kochikai. Kishida faction originally belongs to Koshikai, and he wants to merge with the other original members of the Kyochikai, for instance, the Aso faction or Danigaki group. And if that can happen, they can form a grand faction with 120 members, which would outnumber the Abe faction. And Kishida, Prime Minister Kishida and Vice President Aso are in line with this idea. And in the political circle of Japan, there are some movements towards forming a grand Kochikai. But yesterday, there were talks suddenly of Aso's faction breaking off of this movement, and it seems like the road towards Grand Kochikai is not a very flat and easy road. But still, there are very members close to this idea, and therefore there will continue to be a behind-the-scenes movement towards forming a Grand Kochikai. And then if the moderates can form a larger group, they can certainly be able to resist the powers of Abe faction, the staunch conservatives. So since 1945, when the moderates were the mainstream of Japanese politics, those days could return. And in that case, a dialogue with Korea can perhaps be revitalized. However, such movements by Prime Minister Kishida is not unnoticed by Prime Minister Abe, who continues to pressure Kishida. Recently, former Prime Minister Abe has formed a coalition with quite a staunch conservative named Sakaichi Sanae, who currently heads the Political Research Council of the LDP. Being in the position means making the policies within the LDP. The LDP and the Japanese administration dynamics between the two have reversed at the moment. Within the LDP, the head of policy has a greater power than the prime minister himself. Because of the Abe-Takaichi alliance, they keep pressuring and asserting these ideas onto Kishida, and in the interest of time, to run to my conclusion, the diplomatic boycott against the Beijing Olympics, Kishida was against the idea, but because of Abe and Takaichi, he had to succumb to the pressure and boycotted the Beijing Olympics diplomatically. And nominating the Sado Mines as a World Heritage, Kishida administration's original position had reservations about nominating the Sado Mines as a World Heritage, but he had to do so under pressure of Abe. This will continue on until the upper house elections in July, and if Kishida is victorious, he will have enough power to no longer accept Abe's pressure. So whether he wins or loses the upcoming elections in July will be a make or break factor and really be determined in forming the future line of Kishida. Even if he wins, just because he wins the elections wouldn't strongly improve Korea-Japan relations. What's happening inside Japan is absolutely important. And with that, I would like to conclude my remarks in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
다 못하신 말씀은
And
그런 시간에 좀
what you were not able to say, please use the panel discussion session. As you know, Professor Hosoka grew up in Japan.
한국에서 공부도 하셨고
He studied in Korea. He has experienced the Korean science society
일본의 정치 현상을
and
한국인이
the political situation in Japan is seen from him from Korea. And we were able to hear the gist of that during the presentation.
Now, let's move on to Professor Chae Byung-uk,
말씀해 주시겠습니다.
who will be giving a presentation.
상경대 국가안보학과
He is in the Department of National Security Studies at Sangmyeong University. He was also chief of the Security Research Center at that same university, and he's also a policy advisor with regards to national security in many national committees. Today, he will be giving a presentation on building a security regime and security strategies. Thank you. Hello, I'm Chae Byung-uk from Sangmyeong University, and it is a great honor for me to be here with you. I am here at this forum which talks about the end of war declaration and the way forward. And I think it's indeed a timely theme. I will be talking about issues of national security, the challenges and strategies forward. And I will be shedding light on this topic in light of the current situation regarding the end of war declaration. Now, before we start, I'd like to mention a book, Why Nations Go to War. It's a book by John Stishinger, and I think it's in 10th print, so it's quite famous, and it left a big impression on me. It's a book that analyzes the reasons behind war, and the author says that war is man-made. People in key positions at that time make important decisions that lead to war. In essence, the character, the perspectives of the leader and key figures lead to war. One country may think of another country as an enemy, and if that kind of perception becomes long-standing, that perception becomes reality. It's a very harsh and very eye-opening statement. We talked about strong security, just as Chancellor Hong mentioned. But also I want to touch upon the importance of efforts to build trust. And in that aspect, it's important for us to think about how we respond to North Korean threats. I think we need to be very sophisticated, and we need to maintain the situation by managing the process well. And in that end, because the two sides have already agreed to this, I think the end of war declaration is very important. It may be symbolic and political, but I think that this will be an opportunity for us to build trust, and it will be a foundation for us to lead to a peace agreement. We need help from the international community, and currently North Korea is quite lukewarm, but I think we need to do this to go towards a peace treaty, and this will be vital to peace on the Northeast Asian region, and we need to keep speaking about this to the international community. There's also mention of a preemptive strike, and I think we I think that the people of Korea may feel very comforted because of this kind of a strong approach. But I think, first of all, we have to think about how legitimate this is. I think in terms of self-defense, a preemptive strike can be possible. But in international law, they look into issues of legitimacy, whether it was the last resort, and so forth. That is to say, they think of whether the preemptive strike was really needed. If it's nuclear, it will lead to catastrophic results. And also, is it a last resort? That is, did the party that launched this preemptive strike, was their attack legitimate? But this is quite difficult because most of the time they have used their program as a bargaining chip or leverage, or sometimes to show off. So if North Korea used this, it would lead to a worse situation because it would perhaps create a war, a full-fledged war, which they cannot do away with. Another issue is the fact that we can't do away with all of the threats. They have more than 200 mobile launch pads. So within a few minutes, even if we were able to know how much war power they had, we will not be able to strike them all down in a couple of minutes. So I think it's very important for us to have a strategy of deterrence and also punishment, which means that we need to send the other party the message that when they provoke, that the punishment or the response will be catastrophic. Some people say, then how can this large scale how can this strategy be okay when you are saying that preventive strikes aren't? Well, preventive strikes lead to unnecessary anxiety and also creates a threat towards war. Whereas, if you take the strategy of threat, what happens is that they will not even think of going to war in the first place. In the book that I mentioned, they say when the enemy has a fear or trust that they will be attacked, and if that fear is consistent, then they will try to defend against that by launching a preemptive attack. So in that aspect, I think that the strategy of deterrence is a lot better. Then what about THAAD? I think this is very sensitive because it's not only a military issue but also a diplomatic issue. We need to do it strategically, and it could also strain the tension with North Korea and also our relationship with China as well. In Seongju of Gyeongbuk, when the THAAD missiles were first deployed, the media said that Korea has come to the brink, that this will lead to strained relationships. And China did lash back. And because of this, we may be pushed to the brink of a Cold War yet again. I think that strategically, it has its limitations in being able to defend the metropolitan area because it is a high-level defense system, which means that it's difficult to prevent against the low-range or short-range missiles, as well as other sophisticated warheads. Even if North Korea was able to launch a high-level missile, they say that it will not be possible because even if the THAAD was able to detect this and launch an attack, it will take about 203 seconds, which means that it would be too late. So we already have a Korean-style defense system, which is currently in the process of development for 2026. I think that program will be more feasible than deploying the THAAD. Of course, there are cost issues because the THAAD will take more than 1 trillion Korean won. And if you look at the budgetary data of the US, they say that it will take more than $30 million each year for maintenance alone, whereas the deployment will take about 800 million or so. Also, I think the detection capabilities and sharing of information is very important when we collaborate with Japan as well. So in that aspect, I think we need to cooperate with Japan. Now, the Japanese, Korean, and Chinese military ministers, defense ministers, had an online meeting very recently on the phone. And because of past history issues, we don't have a information sharing, the K-SOMA with Japan as well. But I think that although we don't have the G-SOMA right now, I think we need to have a new security partnership with Japan. And with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Through this forum, there are many things that we want to cover. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time to do that, so my apologies once again. We have a bit of time left over for discussion, so let's use that time for discussions. Now I'd like to invite our final speaker, who has been waiting in Japan for quite a long time until his order of presentation. We will be inviting Mr. Shondo Koichi, who is a member of the representatives at the Japanese House of Representatives, and he will be speaking on how to build friendly relationships between Korea and Japan. Now, Mr. Kondo graduated from the Hyundai University in Japan, majoring in law, and also studied Chinese, and also worked in a newspaper regarding Chinese and Japanese relations. And he has conducted extensive research in international relations. So he is not only a member of the House of Representatives, but also a very academic one as well. He has also worked towards efforts towards climate change, and has also said that we should look at the war history of Japan and take lessons from it. And he has great goals to respond to climate change, preserve the environment, and achieve peace and development in Asia. Mr. Kondo is very fluent in English, of course, but because he is a Japanese national, we believe that it would be better for him to speak in his own mother tongue. On site, we have with us Professor Hosaka, who will be providing the Korean interpretation. We wanted to interpret perhaps simultaneously, but because of this current limitations, we will be doing it consecutively. So, Mr. Kondo, please feel free to say what you want in your mother tongue. Kondo Sensei.
皆さんこんにちは。ご紹介をいただきました衆議院議員の近藤昭一でございます。
Hello, I'm Shondo Koichi, as was introduced.
私の英語は不十分なので
난리가 나겠는데요, 지금? 난 통역사가 있는 줄 알았더니 저분이.
お許しをいただきたいと思います。
제 영어가 조금 지금까지 않기 때문에 일본말로
Because I'm not a fluent speaker of English, I will be speaking in my mother tongue, so I ask for your understanding.
한일 우호 관계를 위한 민간 교류 활성화 방안 그렇게 말씀.
I will be speaking on measures to facilitate private sector exchange for Korean-Japanese friendly relations.
中国、日本ということではなくて、 中部日本、日本の中部にある新聞社、中日新聞というこ
저는
とであります。
중일신문이라는 데서 근무를 하고 있었습니다만은
I worked with 중일 신문,
일본의 춘부라는 뜻이라서요.
And-
중국이라는 뜻은 아닙니다.
it is an area of Jinbu. It does not mean Chinese.
よろしくお願いします。それでは、数年前、日韓関係はかつてないほど良好だと言われた時がありました。日本では韓流ブームが起こり、韓国でも日本文化紹介が解禁をされました。その頃です。しかし、それも過去のものになってしまったばかりでなく、日韓の関係はかつてない厳しさを見せています。
몇 년 전 한일 관계는 전에 없었던 만큼
A few years ago,
양호하다고 흔히들 말을
People often
했습니다.
spoke of the unprecedented relationship between Korea and Japan. The Hallyu, or Korean wave in Japan, resulted in Japanese culture being introduced in Korea also. But this has become history, and now our bilateral ties are strained.
そんな中ですね、新型コロナウイルス感染症の影響で、すべての参加者が現地に集うというわけにはいきませんが、オンラインを活用しながら、こうした日韓関係を考えるシンポジウムが開かれることに敬意を表しますとともに、関係者の皆さんに心から感謝を申し上げます。
Amidst this, due to the COVID-19 situation, all of us are unable to be together physically, but thanks to this online platform, we're gathered at this symposium to think of Korean-Japanese relations, and for that, I pay my respects to all of the organizers and staff for their efforts.
今回お声をかけていただいたユン先生は非核の問題にも大変熱心で、その平和を希求する姿勢に心から敬服しています。さて、数年前、日韓関係がかつてないほど良好だと書きましたが、その頃でも私はやはりきちんとした歴史に対する認識がなければ、真の総合理解は難しいのではないかと申し上げていました。残念ながら現在はその通りになっているのかもしれません。
Now I was invited here by Mr. Yoon Jae-sun, who is very active in the North Korean denuclearization issue. And I have been deeply touched by the attitude that he has towards achieving peace. Now, as I said, Japan and Korea were quite cozy a few years ago, and at that time, I mentioned that without a proper recognition of history, true mutual understanding would be quite difficult. And I said this over many occasions. Unfortunately, I think that my words have become true. And breaking the current deadlock will entail many challenges.
この状況を打開していくには困難も伴います。しかしながら、隣同士の国であり、友好関係を進めていくことは、アジア、ひいては世界の発展と平和につながっていくことと確信しています。また、世論調査を見ればですね、双方の国民感情はよくはありませんが、若い世代の韓国文化に対する親近感は強いものがあると思います。
However, it is my firm belief that as neighbors, building friendly relations between Japan and Korea will pave the way towards global development and peace. Also, while surveys show that the public sentiment towards each other is sour, the younger generation of Japan have a strong affiliation towards Korean culture. And while there is discrimination towards Koreans in Japan, there are many Japanese nationals who are against this, and a hate speech resolution act was enacted in 2016.
また、日本における差別がなくなっていないのも事実ですが、差別に反対する多くの国民が存在し、ヘイトスピーチ解消法も2016年に成立しています。今後、民間交流、とりわけ子どもや若い人たちの実際の交流が大切だと思います。お互いの信頼関係がなければ、歴史に対する認識を広げていくのも難しいのではないでしょうか。
앞으로 민간 교류,
Now, in the future, practical private sector exchange, particularly between children and the younger generation, will become very important. Without a relationship of trust, expanding our recognition of history will not be easy.
私は2000年からキッズ AU 子どもたちのアジア連合キャンプ北東アジア子ども交流という事業に毎年関わっています。残念ながらここのところは新型コロナのために開けてはいません。ロシア、モンゴル、中国、韓国、北朝鮮、そして日本という6つの国の子どもたちに野外活動、キャンプを通じて交流してもらおうという試みです。こうした交流で異なる文化と人間に共通のものの存在を感じてもらいたいと思っています。
Now, since the year 2000, I have been taking part in the Kids AU camp each year, which is a program for kids in Northeast Asia to exchange, although it has not been hosted for the past few years due to the COVID pandemic. The camp invites children from 6 countries, Russia, Mongolia, China, South Korea, North Korea, and Japan, and it is an effort to forge mutual exchange through outdoor camp activities. Through such exchange, I hope that these children realize that there is a common denominator amongst the different cultures and people.
私たちの夢はもともとはですね、EU に倣い、アジアの平和と発展を目指す AU、アジア連合の実現です。そのために、大人の世界は残念ながらいろいろあるけれども、子供には理屈抜き、思い切り遊んで、体で平和を感じてほしい。子供の頃に仲良くなってもらおう。将来に向けて子供たちという種をまこう。そうすれば友達のいる国とは戦争などしないよねということです。
Originally, our dream was to realize an AU, Asia United, which strives for the peace and development of Asia following the EU model. And although adults are weighed down with a lot of different things, I hope that children can feel peace firsthand through play and hands-on activities without having to think of difficult theories. In essence, what we want our kids to be close friends at an early age, and we want to sow seeds for the future through our children. Then you won't go to war with countries where your friends live. So this was the basic thought.
特に南北の平和的統一を願い、南北朝鮮の子どもたちの交流も視野に入れました。残念ながら北朝鮮の子どもを呼ぶことはできませんでしたので、まずは在日朝鮮の子どもたちに参加してもらいました。また北朝鮮と国交のあるモンゴルで会した際には、なんとか 本国から招待したいと、モンゴルの外務大臣とも連携し努力しました。残念ながら実現しませんでしたが、このキャンプで交流した子どもは延べで1000人を超えました。
In particularly, because we want a peaceful unification in Korea, we planned an exchange between the North and South Korean children. Unfortunately, because we were unable to invite North Korean children, we had Koreans in Japan take part. Once, when the event was hosted in Mongolia, which has foreign relations with North Korea, we wanted to invite North Korean children. And therefore, we asked the Mongolian foreign minister to help. Unfortunately, we were unable to have North Korean kids take part, but at that time, there were more than 1,000 children that came.
子どもたちは言葉が通じなくても、キャンプという野外活動を通じて見事に交流を深め、最終日には涙を流して別れを惜しみ、今後の交流を誓い合ってきました。そして深くお互いを理解するとともに、ある意味の厳しい現実も発見していました。つまり、韓国の子供を話すコリア語と在日の子供たちの話すコリア語が微妙に異なるのです。このことを子供たちがどう受け止めたのかは分かりませんが、その姿から感じたのは未来へつながっていくということでした。
Although the children had a language barrier through the outdoor activities and the camp, they were able to exchange with each other, and on the last day, they were in tears as they said goodbye and pledged to continue to exchange with one another. Not only did they come to deeply understand each other, they also came to realize a very harsh reality. For instance, the Korean language that was spoken by the South Korean children and the Korean children in Japan were a bit different. I don't know how the kids felt about this, but what I felt was that this kind of a meeting will lead to future meetings.
残念ながら厳しい状況にある日韓関係ですが、先に申し上げましたように、若い世代を中心に韓国に親しみを感じる人は多くいます。かつて日本は朝鮮通信使を通じて多くの貴重な文化に触れ学びました。この時代に目を向ける交流も盛んであり、私の住む名古屋市緑区でも何年かに一度朝鮮通信使の通った街道を日韓の人々が一緒に歩くという行事も何回か開かれています。
이것을 아이들이 어떻게 받아들였는지는 모르겠습니다만
I don't know how the children thought of the various exchanges, but what I felt was their exchanges will lead to future meetings. Unfortunately, the current Korea and Japan relations are quite strained. But as I mentioned earlier, the younger generation of Japan feel quite close and warm towards Korea. From a very early stage, through the Joseon Tongshinsa, the Joseon missions to Japan, the Japanese were able to come into contact with the precious Korean culture. And at that time, there are various events that look back on that time. In Midori, in Nagoya, where I live, every few years, there is an event where Koreans and Japanese walk the same road that was walked by the Joseon missions.
新たな日韓関係を進め、相互理解を深めるため、音楽やスポーツ等を含め、 さまざまな民間交流を進めていきたいと思います。
In order to improve our mutual relations and expand our mutual understanding, I would like to pursue various private sector exchanges which encompass music and sports.
私は日本の衆議院憲法審査会の委員を務めていますが、与党および野党の一部で改憲、格別救助に関する動きが活発化しています。しかし、日本があの戦争への反省から憲法に定めた平和主義はしっかりと守っていかなければなりません。必要なのは平和主義の具現化であり、そのための民間交流、相互理解の活発化であると思います。ありがとうございました。감사합니다.
Currently, I'm a member of the Constitutional Review Committee in the House of Representatives, and already, both in the leading and opposing parties, there are active movements to amending the Constitution, particularly Article 9. However, I believe that we need to secure the pacifism as set out in the Constitution, starting from the Japanese regret on its war activities. And through that, we will be able to realize pacifism, and we need active private sector exchange and mutual understanding. With that, let me conclude. Thank you for your attention.
콘도 선생, 혼돈이 아리가또 고자이마스. 지금부터 잠깐 통역해 주시면 되겠습니다.
Now, if possible, could you interpret for me?
콘도 쇼이치 중의원 의원님의
We heard from Mr. Kondo, and I was extremely moved by your words.
議員の発表してくださった内容から非常に大きな感銘を覚えました。
무엇보다도 한일 우호 관계에 있어서
You mentioned the friendly relationships between Japan and Korea and the importance of exchange between our children for the future.
の改善に対する法案として青少年子どもたちの交流ということを発表してくださいました。
특별히 그 이외에도
In particular,
한일 관계 우호 관계를 위해서
in order to expand our future exchanges, you touched upon various measures, and so thank you for including that.
일본말로 해야 되는데.
Sorry, I was supposed to speak in Japanese.
それだけではなく今後どのような方策を取っていけばよいのか、日韓関係を改善するためにそのような内容をお話しくださって非常にありがたく感じました。
오늘 말씀하신 내용들이
The message that you sent, I think that many Koreans also agree with your message today.
たちも同じように考えている内容がいくつかございました。
2024년도 평창에서
In 2024, we will be having a Youth Olympics in PyeongChang.
2024年にここ平昌で青少年オリンピックが開催されます。
콘도 쇼이치議員様が
And
꼭 한국에 오셔서
I would like to use this opportunity to extend a formal invitation to you to come to PyeongChang at that occasion.
先生も平昌に来てくださればというふうに強く思います。
네, 지금 시간이
Unfortunately, we don't have that much time. We were supposed to have a early conclusion and leave perhaps 30 minutes or so for discussion and questions and answers. But unfortunately, because I was not a good moderator, we are unable to do that. I will, however, give our speakers a few minutes for closing remarks. If you have any remarks you must make. If not, I think we will wrap up. Do you all agree? Is that okay with you? Thank you for your understanding. Now, today, we are gathered as academics and researchers of peace, and it was a great opportunity to hear from these experts here today. Now, for peace and a peaceful coexistence, we realized the important role that Japan plays. Historically, the relationship between Korea and Japan has been strained. There were longer occasions when we were in conflict, but I believe that we need good relations for future peace in this region. Today, we heard from various peace experts and scholars, and also we heard from a Japanese national who is also a researcher of this issue here in Korea, Professor Hosaka, and also we heard from Mr. Kondo, who has experience in Japan and the Japanese political arena. But we have all realized that all of this dates back several decades, 7 decades actually. So we may have a new administration coming in, but with a new administration, policies change. How can we rationally resolve the current relationship that we have with Japan? How can we move forward? I think, therefore, we need to find the answer in exchange between our people. And in that aspect, I think Mr. Kondo has touched upon a very important key, which is the exchange between our children, our youth. This is something that we can do right now and is a very important factor in our private exchanges. And so with that, the EAPI, our institute, wants to draw upon the importance of Constitution Article 9, the Peace Constitution, because it is a no-war constitution, and we want to propose these people as nominees of the Nobel Peace Prize, and we are pursuing this kind of a movement. I think this kind of a movement, this kind of a campaign, will be a key in restoring the relationship with Japan. I'd like to take this opportunity to once again thank all of our scholars for taking time out of their busy schedules. Especially thank you to Mr. Kondo for your practical proposals. I hope that they will be realized and become a very important foundation in our future as we work towards a peaceful coexistence in Northeast Asia. With that, let me close today's session, and thank you to all of you for being with us. Thank you.